1455's third annual Summerfest. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel. Are we not entertained? The artistry of sports writing. I'm Bram Weinstein. I'm the founder of Empire Media, which is a podcast and digital network in the greater Washington area. I'm also the play-by-play voice of the Washington football team on radio of the NFL. And I host my own radio show on ESPN 630, the Sports Capital, the Bram Weinstein Show. And with me today is the great Washington Post writer, the national baseball writer now, Chelsea Janes, who has a really interesting experience that I think we're going to have an opportunity to talk about, where not only, Chelsea, have you covered sports in recent years, but you also covered an election as well. So you've got to see kind of both sides of storytelling. But I really want to just start overall. You probably do, and I certainly do, get asked to do a lot of things and talk about what we do for a living. It is rare in this vein where sports is treated as storytelling. And I'm actually quite pleased that we got asked to show off our platform, because I think it is overlooked at times that there is craft and storytelling involved in sports coverage.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's really interesting. Sometimes it feels like we're writing about injuries. I'm sure it's the same for you, kind of the basics, the stats, the hurt groins and all that stuff. But I think that what really draws people in, at least I hope, is when you kind of get to know the people involved. And obviously that's where the storytelling comes in, getting people stuff behind the scenes that they can't get just kind of looking on their phone or on Twitter or, even watching at home.
It's the original reality TV too. I don't think people realize,
Yeah.
Whatever you've seen concocted by producers through the years for reality television, it's never touched what sports could produce or provide. Go look at the two teams in the NBA finals right now. Like, you'll never see anything like this.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, it's always stranger than fiction, truly. And, that's one of the things that has certainly kept me interested over the years. It's just the fact that you can see a storyline coming. If you've watched enough games, you kind of can feel where things are going, and then all of a sudden it goes a completely different way, or there's this player with a completely new story. As much as history repeats itself, it just seems like there's always something different happening. Sometimes that feels like chaos, in the course of a baseball season, and I'm sure a football season, there's just all these little dramas that pop up, but there's a story within the story. I was taught writing about baseball that every day is a new chapter in a bigger novel. It's all sort of part of a bigger narrative. And so it's when you get the chance to actually kind of dig into the storytelling part of it, it's kind of perfect for it, honestly.
All right. So I'd like to lean into kind of both of the roles that you've played over the last few years, where you've had the opportunity to go on the road during a major divisive election. And you've also obviously had the opportunity to cover a World Series champion, and now you're covering a sport at large that has its own issues. Let me just, after all this experience, how in your mind do you define storytelling?
It's interesting. I feel like stepping away from sports, I think if I had to answer this question before I went to cover the campaign, I would have said that storytelling is getting to know people, sharing details of their lives and kind of just trying to create some sense of humanity in people that we kind of venerate as sports stars that always seem so far away, and, make their road to where they've gotten sort of relatable. But I think, after my experiences on the campaign, it really just opened my eyes to the number of stories that can go into any one story, if that makes sense. There was always, the issues that were talked about in the campaign, whether it's immigration, whether it's race, whatever it is, there were always a million different people coming at it a million different ways based on where they were. If I'm in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, there's someone there who's got a different take on it because of their story than someone, down at the border, obviously, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things that we've seen a lot in political journalism is sort of a little bit of valuation, I guess, of those stories, which matters, which doesn't, which is politicized, et cetera. But ultimately, like, storytelling in that sense was trying to show how different people come at different things, why they might feel different ways about things, and basically trying to kind of round out an issue in a way that you wouldn't get if you're only thinking about it from your perspective. So coming back to sports, I think the storytelling aspect has sort of changed for me in that I've recognized that telling any one story, sort of, as corny as it sounds, requires hearing a lot of them and sort of, synthesizing and trying to kind of, make a lot of perspectives fit into one. And it's not easy, but I think I've just had a interesting look at how different everyone's kind of stories can be, and how much listening has to be done to, if you're going to tell kind of the whole truth and give a complete picture.
I mean, in both senses too, winning and losing are absolutes. I mean, granted, there's a lot more at stake for political candidates and parties and all that stuff, as opposed to a baseball team or a football team, whether they win or lose their championship. But at the same time, your experience of covering sports, how did that translate into your personal storytelling of the political landscape?
It's interesting. I really feel like I took a more, not frivolous approach, but certainly a more lighthearted approach initially to trying to tell the stories of the politicians that we're covering, or the people, the activists or whoever it was, because in sports, a lot of what you're trying to do, at least in my mind, is just kind of show who these people are, for better or worse, explain how they've got here, these elite talents, these people everyone kind of look up to. You want to just kind of share as much as you can with everyone about who they are. And what is easier about that in sports is there are numbers, right? So good and bad, someone being good at what they do, it's easy to quantify. You can write about someone and say they're an elite baseball player, and here's how they got there, and here's their story, and it's sort of inarguable. The numbers are there, but there's no score in politics. Even the election, which should be sort of a final score, was somehow sort of debatable. So, it really makes you have to, change the way you're trying to explain who these people are. I think in politics, I learned that you just kind of wanted to get a sense of who they were behind the scenes, who they were when they weren't sort of messaging, and when their PR people weren't around. You want to try to show people who these people that they might be voting for really are. And the messages are handcrafted, they don't tell you anything. And so it's sort of a different kind of angle you're looking at. You're trying to, for lack of a better word, expose, whether it's good or bad, more than you are explain. And I think those two things, they're very different in some ways. And the reporting, I think, was similar, but the ultimate kind of goal of writing about people in both realms was really different.
It's funny too, because I've covered sports on different mediums, and we can kind of talk about what I do and how I look at storytelling from a broadcast communication perspective, as opposed to the way that you go with is the written word. But I think we've run into the same thing through the years, and I've done very little in news, mainly have stayed in sports. But the idea of fair game, like, what is information that you would tell about the subjects, and are there lines that you don't feel like you cross? Because while these people are public figures in sports, they're not making laws. They're not going to really affect your life day to day. And, from my perspective of having not covered the political landscape, I think everything's fair game when you're talking about people who can enact change in our everyday life. And I don't think everything is fair game when it's a guy who happens to be paid a lot of money, but he's doing it for our entertainment purposes. So how did you kind of toggle between those lines in storytelling?
I think that's absolutely right. I think that when you were writing about political figures, or even campaigns, which was a lot of the storytelling, was the story of a campaign, of how it moved, of how it fell apart, of whatever it was, you are trying to show who these people are as people are trying to make decisions about who will run a country. And a lot of that is trying to cut through what they want you to write. In politics, there's everything's fair game, but they've also got an answer for everything. So everything you write is, there's a phone call from a PR person saying, well, maybe you should say this, or this is, that's not quite what we want out there. And you're just like, you don't get to control that. But I think in sports, you're right. It's family stuff, for example, is always touchy. You don't necessarily need to kind of rope in personal life or even ask about it. I think it's harder to kind of go there with people unless they want to go there. And I think that makes sense. There's an argument that really only what happens on the field should matter. And, I think that because these people are paid so much and sort of venerated, and teams market them, that makes it easier for us to kind of look at them as whole people and ask them about things that aren't sports related, but really, like, they are entertainers. And the scope is more limited. So I think, in sports, it's certainly, the questions are not quite as tough, I think. But you're right, like politics, I found that you could ask about anything, and you have the right to do that, I think, as a journalist who's, trying to help vet people that are going to run the country. But they're also going to have an answer for everything, and they're going to kind of try to push you whichever way they want. And so that makes the whole experience really different, because suddenly everything sort of feels like a negotiation instead of just kind of a straightforward, profile.
Yeah, the other part with sports too that I think is hard to kind of toggle with at times is you do have information about people that would be part of a story that you don't necessarily think you is worth putting into the story, or could cause harm with access at a later date. And that's a tricky part of sports storytelling too, because the bottom line is these are entertainers. There's clearly genuine interest in what they do, which is why we're employed to do what we do. And it's a massive industry. And sports storytelling has gone on through the ages. But there are complications there. And if you cross those complications, access can be limited at a later date too. So I wonder how you kind of have thought through, how do you deal with the issues of telling the stories you want to tell without burning bridges along the way?
For sure. It's easier in sports, certainly, but in some ways more complicated because the lines aren't as clear, right? When we could be in the clubhouses before COVID, and, hopefully we'll be again, you hear things that, I think would change people's opinions of certain players. If they heard them, fans would be surprised to hear them. It's one of those things. I remember very clearly how surprised people in Washington were when some of the Nats players, visited the White House and seemed supportive of President Trump. And, being inside the clubhouse, you know that's where a lot of guys' heads are. That's how a lot of those people think. And it's not surprising. And it was interesting to see kind of the, oh my gosh, the kind of the uproar from, liberal DC about how some of those guys reacted to the White House visit. And it made me kind of think, like, what do people need to know? Should they know, like, how people think? Does it matter? But in those cases, those guys aren't trying to run the world. They're pleasant to fans. There's, they're not hurting anyone in the clubhouse. It's, if you disagree with their political views, that's going to change your individual view of them, but it doesn't change their statistics as a baseball player. Whereas, if you hear what a politician's saying behind the scenes, and it really reveals a very different way of thinking than they've portrayed publicly, that's important, because that's going to be what they're relying on when they're potentially leading the country. So it's a really interesting line. But I think for me, certainly, as politics have become as divisive as they have lately, it's been interesting to watch the sports world kind of interact with that, and people express their expectations of players, and, buying jerseys, even, whose jersey should I buy? What is this guy like? It's really interesting. But I think, it's obviously less important that we know those things about athletes whose statistics ultimately justify the money they make in some ways, and are how we kind of decide who's good and who's bad.
I want to get into structure with you and how you think through writing just in general, which is really a big part of why we're here today. And I don't want to get too off topic, but considering the divisiveness that's going on, you were following the election, and sports have largely, leagues, players, teams have largely jumped into political discourse more so, and not that they haven't in the past, but really heavily over the last year and a half, specifically with Black Lives Matter and some of the other political movements that are having. How do you kind of shape the idea of telling sports at large as they have endeavored into a space that at times can be very uncomfortable for them to communicate?
I think coming back from politics, it was more evident to me than when I initially covered baseball, just how, frankly, stodgy these institutions are when it comes to these things, how uncomfortable they are talking about anything on which people would have different opinions, right? They don't want to alienate anyone. It's bad for the business. So from my perspective, the best way to, acknowledge the changes that are happening in terms of how sports interact with these issues is to let the players who have pushed that, kind of talk for themselves. And, you're seeing the dialogue change a lot. Teams are having different reactions. There's more of a willingness to engage there. But a lot of that, I think, really comes from the players and comes from, their willingness to speak out and the team's therefore responsibility to support them. So, it's something that you're willing to ask about. A lot of guys sort of initiate that conversation nowadays on social media, which sort of, in my mind at least, opens the door for you to go up to someone and say, hey, is this something you want to talk about? Do you have opinions that you want to share? Is there an experience you have that makes you think people should know how you feel about this? But it's definitely a little bit thorny because teams would probably prefer that guys don't talk about that stuff at all. And it's not something you can go to a team and say, hey, can I talk to everyone you have about, Major League Baseball's problem with domestic violence, right? Like no one wants to talk about that, or race. We're only really just getting into maybe the last 18 months of even teams sort of issuing statements on things like social justice. So for me, the players have really led that. And if they want to use their platform to kind of talk about that, then that opens the door for me to ask. But it's certainly not something that a lot of people still want to talk about. So it's really impressive, I think, what a few players, Major League Baseball is behind everybody else. The NBA has obviously been very outspoken, WNBA, but, it really has been the players that have kind of pushed that conversation. And, the goal is to kind of, if they want to have it, to let them have it.
It's funny, like I've lived a lot of my career on radio and specifically sports radio, which is a very niche, market. And you've had the opportunity to work at a very broad, important newspaper that's going to cover a variety of topics nationally, right? I know what my audience is when they're tuning into my show. And while some of this newsworthiness stuff creeps into dialogue, I know why people are listening to me. As you kind of navigate your audience for sports, modern sports fans, do they want the nuts and bolts of just what's happening on the field? Are they looking for complex storytelling? Like, what are people who read the Washington Post sports section saying back to you that they want from you?
I'm really still kind of trying to feel that out, particularly covering baseball as a whole. I think with the local teams, which is, I think, related to what you've said, you kind of know what Nationals fans want. And in covering them for 4 years, they want every little bit of content about every player and every joke that's made. And, everyone's kind of in on everything and follows the ups and downs. And so that audience, it's not that you write to the audience, but you sort of can, give little details and stuff that maybe a national audience wouldn't click on, that Nationals fans will care about. And for me, something I've had to try to adjust to as I've covered the sport as a whole is I think that the stories that sort of capture readers beyond, team level beat reporting are frankly either really interesting, profiles of people with really interesting stories that you just can't imagine, or they have to do with the big, issues, whether that's, I don't know if sticky stuff on the baseball is a big issue in the grand scheme of things, but, the things that are changing, the things that players complain about, the things that owners are hashing out. And so, I think those issues and the conversations around them seem to be what people want to hear about. I don't think, a recap of a game really does much for anyone because we are all on Twitter. We're all looking at apps on our phone. But it seems to me that just getting to the heart of these issues and how players really think about them seems to be something that garners a lot of interest. And I think it's just really obvious to me that after all the Black Lives Matter stuff last year, after the election, those kind of social justice issues, even issues of, labor, of minimum wage in the minor leagues, people really want to have those conversations. This is the time to sort of, create upheaval in institutions that have frustrated people for a long time. And in my experience, Major League Baseball is one where people are interested in hearing about what needs to change and what hasn't changed and how it's going to change. And it's a really interesting time to kind of be trying to feel out that audience because it feels like they want more than just this guy's good at baseball and this guy's not.
Yeah, I mean, the craft of storytelling is interesting, but in the end, to be successful at it, you have to know what your audience wants. And what's really interesting with sports is I just saw a trailer for a biopic of Kurt Warner, who's a great, incredible underdog story of sports history, where he's bagging groceries and trying out for teams and doesn't get a chance and finally does and gets inserted and has the best 3 years any quarterback's ever had. And all of a sudden he's in the Hall of Fame. And this is this incredible underdog story. and LeBron James is going to be in Space Jam 2 or whatever the remake is. And there's a heroic aspect to the athlete as part of this. And most of the really famous sports films and stories that have come out are really this kind of either heroic type of backdrop or underdog made good, like Rudy or the Miracle team of the 1980 Olympics, or even a made up story like Rocky is an underdog hero. So as you kind of look at sports and storytelling, do you believe that the framework still needs to kind of fit this old, I guess, path of this is what people want? There's some kind of guy from nowhere made it to become great, or there has to be a hero attachment to that type of story that's told?
That's a great question. And it's really interesting because I think that obviously those underdog stories are always going to play, for lack of a better phrase, right? I think they let people dream, they give people hope, they give people someone to root for that, you know, they look at and say, maybe I can do that somehow, right? But what I have noticed, and especially in the last even 6 months, is there's a real niche, I guess, for sort of honest stories about people, whether that's struggles with mental health that don't necessarily end in triumph, or, you know, people talking about, you know, substance abuse or addiction, or why they left this sport, or why the media, you know, put too much pressure on them and they couldn't handle it. There's sort of a willingness to be not the hero in a way, or to, you know, to be the hero by, you know, being vulnerable kind of. And it's definitely not a genre that existed that much. I mean, I really remember Josh Hamilton back in the day, you know, 5-10 years ago, was one of those stories where this guy was an addict and made good in the end, and everyone kind of felt good about it. And that was like as close as you would come, was the guy who kind of overcame and made their way and ended up having a happy ending at a home run derby. And he has since not had a happy ending, but you didn't really get those stories. And now I think people are really comfortable saying, this is what someone who had a lot of talent is dealing with, and this is how they fell apart, because it happens, you know? So it's just interesting how much more honest I think those conversations have become. But I mean, for every one of those, there's 5 stories that are probably clicked on more about, you know, the amazing comeback, or the,
Right.
you know, the player who kind of comes out of nowhere. And that makes sense too, because it brings joy to people, and it should. But I've been really, I guess, impressed and encouraged by the thirst, I think, for stories about like honest and not always flattering experiences that these people have.
And I think we're finding now with the advent of social media, which I think is really interesting, how athletes use it more so than teams, but how athletes themselves use it, that they are willing to be themselves here and pull away a curtain. And some of this framing that is partially what we do as a living, because we are handing people these kind of typically very positive stories about this type of stuff because it resonates. I think the curtain is down on how the human qualities that a lot of these people have, and therefore they're almost trying to redefine their own narratives as they go along. So I do wonder how storytelling will shift, and if it is in a more honest place. I mean, another example I saw of this in recent years was the kneeling on the field at the football games, which, you know, I don't want to get into these political spots again, but the reality was, like, I think what was really eye-opening about the pushback to that was that how associated leagues had put themselves with the military, with the flag, with the colors of the country. And by doing anything that was counter to being in line with that was going to have a very negative perception. So we've had hero stories, we've had this is all American stories, and we've had access now to athletes that would be memorialized in certain ways, but have opened themselves up and made themselves so accessible that you see how human they really are. So I see storytelling in sports really evolving differently, and it's been happening in real time.
I totally agree. And I think, you know, one of the things that made a lot of athletes, at least that I encountered, hesitant to talk to reporters was this idea that, like, you're going to take what I say and you're a filter. And maybe you're a really well-intentioned filter that I trust, but it's still a filter, and it's not necessarily going to come out in a way that I feel good about. But now, you know, you post on Instagram, you can write as much as you want and explain yourself. And that I guess might bother some reporters who feel like gatekeepers, and that's fine. But I think what it really does is it gives you a chance to sort of understand what these people are going through on a better level and get them to talk about things in ways you wouldn't even know to ask about if they didn't do that. So I think it's great, and I think it's forcing people to really kind of rethink those traditional narratives and, I don't know, I think listen more, frankly, to the people that we're covering.
So tell me a little bit about your method, how you think through storytelling, how you structure a story. And obviously they're all different, clearly. I mean, nothing can all be the same, but as you kind of think through storytelling through the lens of as a sports reporter, how do you kind of envision putting together what you do?
It's always changing. I think I'm changing when I read something that's better than something I can do. I'm like, oh, I should try to structure it that way down the line. But I think basically one of my main goals always is just to provide as much detail as possible that you can't get or wouldn't know elsewhere. And structurally, how that manifests itself can be different, right? Maybe you start, trying to show a side of someone with an anecdote that you haven't, that you wouldn't know otherwise. Maybe, you're going kind of more straightforward and introducing an issue and then using someone to kind of show how that issue matters. But by and large, I think for me, far more important than anything structural, because I am always all over the place in that way and constantly changing my mind about what works. I think, the detail is what really matters. I want everything to be based around that. Little things, whether it's like before every at bat, this player does X because X, it just gives you a little more insight into those moments, those thought processes and stuff. And, hopefully those details are more revealing than that. But for me, like when I sit down to write a story, sort of the first threshold I have to cross is, do I have detail? Am I saying something new? And then how do I use that to kind of, say something that hasn't been said before? We can all write about, X player is a great player, and here are the numbers that support that. But how did you get there? What don't we know? What questions haven't we answered? And I think for me, those details and making sure I'm answering a question are really key to how I structure stories.
This is probably a preference thing for you, but are you more attracted to telling the personality story, or are you more attracted to telling the story of an event?
It's a great question. I think I really enjoy an event because you have to be quick and you can't overthink it, but that is not exactly a structural thing or anything. It's more just the more time I have to overanalyze something, I think we're all worse off. But the thing I like about an event is that you can really describe what's happening as a product of what's happened, right? So if I cover a team that gets to the World Series and someone comes up with a big hit, all of a sudden, yes, that event, you say this person hit a home run, but you've been there all along. You can explain what it took to get there. And I always think that's so interesting is, no one swing or touchdown or whatever is sort of in a vacuum. They come from years of work or a conversation somebody had months earlier about, we should try this. And so for me, I think that's a lot of fun. But the personalities are good too. I think personally, I just worry sometimes that I'm not getting it right, that you don't know enough, that, you're either filtering or you're not filtering, or someone is giving you a perception of themselves that isn't
Here's
real.
your one-on-one, but it's only 10 minutes long, right? How much do
Exactly.
you really
Yeah,
learn about this
exactly.
person? Or even on one specific event, if they tell you we'll give you access to this person, but you have 10 minutes with them, that may or may not be
Exactly.
enough to really fully give context to what has happened in their lives or shape a story that is a narrative about their growth.
Exactly. And I certainly wouldn't want someone talking to me for 10 minutes and then writing about me. So I completely understand it. And it's a little more uncomfortable for me, but there are people who do it incredibly well. And I aspire to that, their ability to do that.
I mean, I think one of the other things about sports storytelling, I think it's overlooked because mainly I think people who are just not hardcore fans will dip in and out and go through big subjects. And when the Nationals are in the World Series or the Capitals are winning the Stanley Cup, like obviously people then are more tuned in and following what's happening. But on the day-to-day basis, they're not paying that close of attention, like in the middle of June when the Nationals are just playing another game against somebody. But I think recently we had a really good example of where storytelling can kind of come from the most odd places and events that occur can be shaped into really interesting stories. There was a recent incident at a game. You had mentioned the sticky stuff controversy. And for those of you watching this probably don't know what we're talking about. Pitchers are allowed to use certain types of substances to keep the grip on the baseball, partially because of control issues. They're throwing the ball 90 to 100 miles per hour, and people can get hurt if they don't have this control. There are people that have come along that have gone Breaking Bad on some of this stuff and concocted these things that have allowed for the pitchers to have too much control, and the ball is spinning at very high rates, and there's offenses being marginalized in the sport because the pitchers have too much control. And baseball countered this recently by saying, you cannot use these substances. We will punish you if you don't. And because it happened in the middle of the season, and because everybody was a candidate to be guilty of using this stuff, there was a weird couple of weeks where there were almost like stop and frisk moments in the middle of baseball games. And this occurred in a Nationals Phillies game where a certain Hall of Famer, Max Scherzer, gets asked to be checked multiple times by a manager of the Philadelphia Phillies. And at one point, he gets so frustrated, he almost pulls down his pants to show that he is not using any of this stuff or hiding any of these illegal things. And I only point this out because there's parody, there's unique storytelling, there is could not have seen anything like this ever coming, to be part of a Hall of Fame story, that there are now pictures of him having had this moment, and what this may shape for how Max Scherzer performs the rest of the year. Because, by the way, for those of us who follow it, Max Scherzer is known to have used substances that have now been deemed illegal and weren't a problem in the past. And I wonder if like that kind of resonates with what we're talking about here, is that I don't think people realize that on a day-to-day basis, there are a lot of incredible opportunities to tell incredible stories in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, for sure. And that one is even, it's a perfect example because it's so layered. And I think baseball lends itself to this because they play so often. There are so many moments you file away, but like Max Scherzer is a member of the players union. He is gearing up for a labor negotiation in the offseason. He has points to prove. He's always mad at the league. He's a dramatic guy. You know, there's all these things that you can use that moment to show about him and explain about his thinking. And I think for me, those moments pop up a lot. There are just a lot of little things that happen that allow you to get some insight into people if you know where to look. And so for me, those events, like you were talking about before, are kind of fascinating. And I'm curious, you know better than I do, just sort of how things like that play when you're trying to talk about them live. Because I at least have time to think about them before I have to write about them and give that context. But I just wonder like what it's like to sort of have to deal with that in real time.
Yeah, I mean, those are gifts for people like me when we have spots like this, because these are the moments that will be remembered, for us, because we have to get it right. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to be factually correct, but at the same time, in doing it on radio, and I think that this isn't realistic anymore. It used to be you were doing it there and painting a picture because literally people could not see it, and they're either driving in their car, they're listening to the radio. I would go with the majority of people who listen to the home broadcast of the Washington football team are also streaming it somewhere and are probably watching it also at the same time. So we're in a very different space. But play by play, and I like from the audio perspective because it forces me to think through painting a picture for somebody, is a skill set and a craft that I'm very proud of, because it is audio storytelling. If I do not paint the picture correctly of what the weather is, what the grass looks like, whether this person, his jersey is torn or muddy, or what the score is, or what the heightened moment may be, and to have the right tone and inflection for what this 3rd and 2 play in the 4th quarter of a 17-17 game really actually means in the larger context, you have to almost become a vessel for fandom, and you try to hit the notes in the right way. And it really, over time, it's just craft. And probably in your writing, you followed people and you watched people and you read people, and that started to probably guide you, I would think, in the way that you wanted to become as a writer. And for me, I watched people and listened to people and took lessons and recognized where tone should toggle up, but not too much, and tone should come down, and what kind of adjectives would be very helpful in setting a scene. And it's a never-ending quest for, probably for you too, in writing, that you'll never achieve, which is perfection, which is always what I'm looking for, but is completely unattainable. But it is, I've told people in calling games, it's the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life. You might as well be on a drug. It's because it's so heightened. You have to be in the moment, and you have to be able to summon the words and hope that they come out of your mouth cleanly, precisely, and the way that is easily understood and really felt emotionally by the person on the other side. It's a difficult but really fun, interesting craft.
It's interesting. I grew up listening to like baseball games on the radio, and those voices become such a staple of your, well, at least for me, my childhood and stuff like that. And what's interesting for me is like, you think TV is going to kind of change people's willingness to listen, but it seems like podcasts are back. It just seems like the audio genre is so crucial to people and very personal in a way that kind of makes it outlast screen time. And I wonder if anything's kind of changed for you in that way since the podcasts have come and stuff like that.
Yes. So no longer, are you in an exclusive space? And I think in your realm, you probably ran into this too. Like, working for the Washington Post still is a remarkably prominent thing to do, but there are now so many blogs and options of people who can get information, and not the same access that you can get, but there's access to options. So no longer have we cornered that market. So where if you ended up into that position, that you are one of the few that are walking into the room, or you're one of the few whose voices kind of matter in the space. So that has changed a lot. I do know that what's tried and true, and it's funny, I'm glad we're here doing this, because I'm an adjunct professor as well at my alma mater, American University. I teach writing. And I tell everyone that no matter what, you get into, whether it's blogging, video, podcasting, television, linear, digital, whatever it may be, and whatever's coming, like whatever shows are going to be on TikTok in 2 years, whatever's coming down the road, that if you can't write and you can't find your voice through writing, and you're not a good storyteller, you will not be able to have a long career in this. That what is tried and true in this is you have to learn craft of storytelling. If you're incapable, and that may change with where you do it, whether it's a 30-second piece for Twitter or Instagram, or a long form 30-minute podcast about Dwayne Haskins and his very short career with the Washington football team. Either one of those still, and they may be different, but they matter in how you construct the words, how you tell the story, the arc of it, and all of that remains the same. I feel like in my realm, and I don't know if you feel the same way, because I think in a lot of ways what's happened here is the sports media community and the sports storytellers has been fractured, because of all these different access points for fans to find the information. It's led to sports departments either shuttering entirely or losing a lot of resources along the way. And this has happened, throughout. You'll see layoffs at places as big as ESPN, and you'll see newspapers that had major community influence shut down sports departments entirely. At the same time, there's a lot of new space that's opening up in a modern way. And what I see there is the tried and true tenets of being able to tell stories will last. So whether it's in podcasting or radio or television or newspapers / blog / digital internet, written word, I still think that those who are good at the craft will succeed at it. It's just an interesting kind of winding road to find that route. Like when I graduated college in the mid 1990s and then started my career on air, it was very clear where you had to go to get to spaces where you could have some kind of relevance. Now, when I talk to students, I go, you don't know how lucky you are to have the opportunities that are in front of you, because the gatekeepers are far, far fewer than they used to be, and you can kind of make your own way. At the same time, you need to learn how to do this in a way that's effective communication. And when you learn to do it with effective communication, it'll open a lot of different doors for you.
There's no doubt. And it's super interesting because baseball especially draws a lot of, people who take on very small parts of the game and write about only that and become really big experts on that. And numbers have become a huge part of the conversation around baseball. Analytics, data, all this stuff has really come to the forefront as a way teams make decisions and players evaluate themselves. And something that I think has been really cool, particularly when it comes to, the gatekeepers maybe having a little bit less influence for the better, is that a lot of these sites where people were talking about data, in 2010 and sort of, on the forefront of that, they're now authorities. You go to them because they've been on this the whole time and they push everyone else to be able to kind of have that conversation. And I've had to read a whole lot just to kind of understand what they've always understood. And so I think it's pushing people, the proliferation of kind of, I don't know, maybe that's the wrong word, but just kind of the prevalence of places where people are publishing, the ability people have to kind of become authorities just by being good at what they do, which is great. It really pushes everyone else to kind of get there too and to think creatively. And for me, like, I have come back to baseball after 2 years away to a sport that is even more data driven than it was, like 24 months before I got back. And it's been fascinating to see how some of these websites that were always talking about this have really begun to use those numbers in ways that tell stories, that explain why a pitcher did this, that explain how a hitter kind of found himself again. And, people who are experts in numbers or whatever it is, are able to sort of get that out there and be authorities in ways I don't know that they always were when traditional media was so dominant. And as someone who has benefited from the platform of being at the Washington Post, I think it pushes everyone to sort of get on that level and become, you can't just kind of skate by, writing the same old way when there are people out there that are writing about new things and really know what they're talking about. And the only difference is you click on one link or not or the other, So I think for me, it's been really interesting just to watch how, as more information has been available, as social media has sort of allowed more people to market what they know and what they write, you really do find that the conversations are elevated, that there are, everybody sort of has to get better and smarter and try harder and be more creative. And I think that's been a huge influence on me, at least, a source of stress, certainly, but like in a good way. And I just really appreciate it. And I think that's really changing how, traditional sports writing is done too.
I think it's interesting. I want to go back to access for a moment. I want to see what your experience has been. And now coming back to sports, as more and more of this stuff opens up, as more and more people are engaging, in all journalism, not just sports journalism. I mean, I'm sure there's 8 trillion political blogs that are out there too, that don't have the access to the candidates, but they do have audiences and they have YouTube channels and all of those types of things. So this is happening, this is certainly not exclusive to sports, but it's happening here too. I have actually found, which I thought was unintended consequence of all of this is that the teams and sometimes the players, but mainly the teams in the leagues, suddenly see the value in giving the access back to the professionals again, when at times arm's length is maybe not the best way to put it, but certainly they did not want you behind the curtain for a lot of reasons. Now I'm finding they're being a touch more welcoming because they know how many things are being said by how many people who aren't that informed because they don't have the access. And it feels like it's important for them to kind of rein that back in and make sure that the information is being ciphered through professionals. So I wonder if you've had kind of a similar experience. I have found PR staffs to be a little friendlier in this modern era of storytelling in sports than maybe they were in the past.
I think that's true. For all the blogs that sort of, like I said, force you to think about things in new ways, they also don't have to necessarily ever interact with the people they write about. And some of them I think would love to do that and don't get the access. And some I think don't really care. But what that does is creates a little bit of a lesser accountability. And I think teams, certainly in baseball, understand that if you have to show up the next day and build relationships with the people you're covering, that's a different level of yeah, accountability, there's a different responsibility there. You're not just kind of lobbing shots from the bleachers. And so I think they see that there is, value in communicating with those people that are there every day and have it in their interest to sort of be really, really fair. And that's not to say that all blogs are not fair. I don't think that's true at all. But I think it is, from a PR perspective, really smart to work with people and see every day, because those people have to answer for what they write. And that's always been true in baseball. It's the number one rule. If you write something bad, show up the next day. And that's something I think teams are valuing more and more as it becomes easier and easier to just kind of put an opinion out and not back it up.
I'm not sure I would call Instagram or Twitter storytelling. It is, I guess, for some people, but in the modern space, we have to use it. I mean, we have no choice but to be engaged with it. How do you kind of view using modern social media to interact with your audience? And I don't know if storytelling is the right frame to put that in, but maybe why don't we just start with I'll tell you what my view is on it, but I want to hear what your view is on using it to interact with people.
It's funny. I really have kind of stopped using Instagram a lot. I used to kind of use it to track, my various travels and things like that. But I think that what I've discovered is that professional sports, you can tweet, you can kind of add a little bit to the conversation, but it's more of a place, not so much to tell stories as to sort of, build who you are, get to know people. But I covered high school sports when I first got to the Post, and there, things like Vine, which is, gone now, and Instagram were really important because the kids got to see videos of themselves and retweet them. And, I don't know, it just became sort of a access to replays that they didn't have otherwise. And so I think it really does, professional sports, as good as social media is for getting athletes out there, sometimes I feel like in professional sports, it kind of, devolves into a place where you shoot opinions at one another and doesn't necessarily help anything. But yeah, it's not something I so much use to tell stories as to connect with people, which I think helps you understand your audience. But there are places, I think, in sports journalism where it can be really helpful. I think, obviously television rights make that a little bit more difficult in some ways.
I look at it only from the sports media realm in two ways, and I don't post a lot, and I'm not someone who likes to put much of my personal life out on it. I just, that's just personal choice I've made. But from a storytelling and sports media perspective, I've seen two things for social media that can be useful. One is if you do have news, because that will be something that we'll be engaged with. And I don't think, long gone are the days that the Washington Post can hold on to a news item to vet. You have to put it out there as quickly as possible. There's just too much access. And the other one, and this is in sports media, but I guess politics can be extremely subjective too. But in sports, subjectivity is the lifeblood of it. And therefore, if you can craft something that is educative but provocative, everybody's a columnist now, and everybody wants to have an opinion, and everybody wants to react to that. And if you're going to utilize social media from a storytelling perspective, it must be done in a way to attract interaction and engagement. And those are the only two reasons why I could see professionally why I would use it.
I definitely say things on Twitter that veer into the opinion, that veer into like a column. And I think I am more calculated than a lot of people in that way. But it's absolutely true that there are things that I will say on that platform, personal experiences, whatever it is, that would never be public if I were just writing for a newspaper. And I think in some cases that is helpful. I think where I find it really helpful is, when we've had to talk about issues that deal with women in sports, and that's an experience I have that other people don't. So I can kind of, I wouldn't necessarily write an article about it, but I can tweet about it and say, here's what I've had. Certainly when it comes to race and players or reporters who have dealt with things that I, as a white woman, have not, they can often use Twitter in ways they can't, use traditional media platforms and kind of share things. And I think that's really helpful and gives us all a better sense of the stories that we're trying to tell. But by and large, I think, I don't think the storytelling would suffer all that much if we lost Twitter. But I just think it helps elevate voices that do need to be heard, but it does kind of blur that line between like columnist and reporter, which was already pretty blurry in a lot of cases, and
Yeah.
it can get you into trouble.
I mean, I wonder if that even exists anymore because, like when I was a kid and I'd read the Post as a kid, I would read whoever the beat reporters were of the team and they would give me the news of the day. And it could be of major importance. It could not. And then I'd turn to the next page and there's a column from Michael Wilbon or Tom Boswell or Tony Kornheiser, and they're giving you their opinion on that. And it was all kind of clearly delineated of what you're reading here is opinion versus this is straight news. And, maybe this changed with ESPN, which is, I worked there for 7 years, where as an on-air anchor, my job technically really is just to read the news of the day and turn to the experts. But as anyone who's ever watched the storytelling that occurs on ESPN, there's not a single person on there that is going to be the straight anchor any longer, short of maybe Bob Lee in recent years. Everyone else is coloring how they're characterizing anything that they do. I'm guilty of it too. I took pride in the leads that I wrote into the stories that I would tell, and it was clearly opinionated with how I thought the story should be told. And I just don't know, is there a such thing as straight reporting in sports media any longer, where everybody seemingly has some level of an opinion of what they're dealing with and what they're covering?
It's a great question. I think about it often. I think about, to be honest, I've thought about it a lot more since I got back from politics, where I don't know that straight reporting sometimes is even as possible as people want it to be. There's so many different takes on things, so many different ideas of what truth looks like, that, you could write here, you could just kind of post a picture of a politician's policy and that would be really straightforward, but almost anything else you do can be construed as, being coming from one way or the other. And I think in sports, certainly, people who cover teams every day are gonna sort of have opinions about those teams. They're gonna have thoughts. They're gonna be surprised by things. They're gonna express those things. And I think, is that opinion? Yes. I do think in some cases it enhances, someone's experience following those teams or reading those stories, because you are an authority figure if you're there all the time. Hopefully you know what you're talking about. And so, if I convey that it's surprising that X happened, or, that this guy should have done X, I'm going to try to stay away from that language, but it doesn't necessarily veer into column world, but it's a really blurry line. And I think that's okay in sports sometimes, often. I think where you get into trouble is when we're not talking about, should this runner have gone for second, should they have called a pass play instead? And when you get into, should X controversial player has been here? Should this issue be a reason not to sign someone? And I do think that it's not black and white anymore, and you have to trust people to navigate it, which sometimes they do and sometimes they don't.
Yeah. The other thing that's really different too, and I wonder if you agree with this now, and I wonder where this is going to go really over the next 10, 15, 20 years in terms of coverage of sports, or if you consider esports, sports, and things of that nature. Sports always had not only heroic storylines and underdog storylines, but aspirational storylines. And, you can be a hero. Anybody can grow up and become a great baseball player, golfer, football player, basketball player, whatever it may be. And you can do this and you will get all this fame and glory, and it'll be on these massive stages with these, coliseums of people cheering you on. And these other sports that didn't have that level of popularity, well, they weren't accessible to people because they weren't profiled. And now social media and the internet has allowed for anything to have popularity if the right personalities are there and the right stories are told. So there are BMX bike riders with 10 million Instagram followers, and surfers that have more social media followings, and name, image, and likeness became a big, huge story in college athletics. And one of the big winners of this is a gymnast at LSU who happens to have multiple million followers on TikTok and Twitter and is getting branding and licenses. And I wonder if aspirationally, and this might be a problem for big traditional sports leagues, if those aspirations of kids and people who are interested in sports and success start filtering to other areas. Poker had a boom, BMX alt sports, snowboarding, surfing, esports now, which I think is a humongous growth platform for storytelling and for aspirational lifestyle. Like, I do feel like that we're in a different space where sports at large has a lot of competition to keep that aspirational feel attached to it.
For sure. I think that's absolutely right. I also think that perhaps those kind of stories that are more, esports, for example, or the LSU gymnasts you mentioned, those stories don't necessarily have any less, heroic value, obviously, because they are not in high profile sports. They don't have any less value to, ex-human who's looking for inspiration. Every 4 years, we all care a lot about Olympic sports that we don't think about a lot of the other time. And those stories are some of the most meaningful people find. And I think the more access to those stories, the better, period. Certainly maybe MLB and the NFL don't want to hear that. But like from my perspective, it's probably my job to understand esports better because there's probably a great story there too, right? And I just think, people just love, like you've said, an aspirational story. They like looking at someone and saying, maybe I could do that, or maybe when I'm down and out, I'm not down and out. And whether that's a gymnast or whether that's a BMX guy who comes back from a huge accident and is good again, those things matter. And I think it's okay if the big four sports don't have a monopoly on those anymore. And it's just will kind of sports media adapt? Will we be open to those things? I don't know, but I think it's fascinating and maybe even brings more people in to kind of sports journalism and looking for these stories than would be brought in otherwise.
All right, we'll close up with this. I'll tell you the most memorable things in having a career covering sports. The ones that stick with me the most actually are probably the most human part of it, which were the tragedies that occurred. And I don't know why specifically that stuck with me, but I covered the Washington football team when Sean Taylor was murdered, and it has stuck with me. And the death of the great Maryland basketball player Len Bias as a child has stuck with me. And I don't know, maybe there was just some realism attached to that really did that for me. You don't have to go down the same path, but I'm just curious, what are the sports stories that you've either written or read that have really stuck with you?
For me, actually, and it is a little different. I think I got to go to the Winter Olympics in 2018 and cover the U.S. women's hockey team. And I had known some people that played hockey. I had a cousin who played women's hockey in college. And so as like a girl who played sports growing up, there aren't, you've heard this a million times, there weren't that many people. The U.S. women's soccer team was kind of just getting to the level of prominence it was at. And, you weren't really given many opportunities to sort of root year after year for the same female athletes on a national stage. And when I was covering the U.S. women's hockey game against Canada, certainly a lot of people couldn't have told you 5 players on either of those teams, but you kind of knew that there was a rivalry and you kind of knew that people were going to watch. And I ended up being in the building watching next to Julie Foudy, who was one of the stars of kind of the first big prominent U.S. women's national, soccer teams. And for me personally, that was one of the few times where I kind of I got to sit next to someone I had looked up to, watching a sport that we both cared about for the same reason, which was we were seeing women's sports kind of grow and get a bigger platform. And the game was spectacular and it's at the Olympics. I mean, what more can you kind of want? And it was just really meaningful to me because it was a marker of, kind of the growth of something I didn't know would grow. Like it was a women's sports thing where there was a generational women's athlete next to me. In football, baseball, you're always bringing back the old timers. And you don't always have that in women's sports. So for me, that was really meaningful to kind of have her there and, sitting next to me, like grabbing my arm when, it got tense. And I was like, I can't believe this is happening because as a kid, this just never seemed possible that, I'd be covering women's sport at the highest level next to a legend who's also from women's sports. And so that's really stuck with me. But I think also, obviously the really personal stuff too is, I've been lucky enough not to encounter those tragedies on that scale, but there are always moments, whether it's like the death of a coach's family member or something unexpectedly, they build bonds and you kind of feel like you connect with those people for years to come just because you had to write about kind of the worst moment of their life.
Yep. Chelsea, hey, this was a pleasure doing this with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
You can read Chelsea Janes in the Washington Post. And thank you all again for joining us today. We're pleased you got to spend some time with us, and we hope the discussion has been valuable for you. And please be sure to check out 1455 Literary Arts at www.1455litarts.org to learn more about the organization and the free programming that's offered throughout the year. I'm Bram Weinstein with Chelsea Janes. Great day.